Okay, Acts 14, and if you remember last week with Acts 13, if you remember where we left off, we were learning about Paul and Barnabas and their journeys, and in Acts 14 we continue with the same apostles. To go find my notes. Nope, here they are. Okay. Yes, I know. And we're going to start off talking about some of the division that was encountered when the apostles started preaching the gospel. So it seems like that's what happens every time the gospel is preached. There's division that occurs, and that was true in the first preaching of the gospel, and it is true today. And we see that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So beginning in verse 1 in Acts 14, they are at Iconium, and this is Paul and Barnabas. Now it happened in Iconium that they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and so spoke that a great multitude of the Jews and the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Verse 4, but the multitude of the city was divided. Part sided with the Jews and part with the apostles. And when a violent attempt was made by both the Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to abuse and stone them, they became aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia and the surrounding region. And they were preaching the gospel there. So a few things stand out to me, and first, speaking of the division, we have two sides of an issue, but there's not just two groups. Typically, there's three groups involved. You've got both sides, but then you've got an undecided group, a group that maybe their interest isn't that great, or they just want to hear both sides of the story and make up their own mind. And that's what is really what is being fought over at this point, are those undecided. Because it would really be a shocking verse to read that one of the apostles might be swayed by the unbelievers to abandon everything that they've witnessed and go over to their side. And likewise, we would be shocked to probably read about a Pharisee giving up their traditions, and although it did happen, it's pretty rare that they're convinced to come over and become one of the believers. You can think those sides really have their heels dug in, and we see that today as well, right, in politics or in other issues. So it's really a battle for those undecided folks, for their souls, between those believers and then the unbelievers and those who are really riled up against what the apostles are preaching at this time. Another thing that stands out too, and I kind of realized it as I was studying this, is that we know that the apostles faced great danger during this time preaching the gospel, right? I mean, their lives were threatened, and here we see another example of that. The people wanted to rise up against them. They got enough support. They were going to stone them and kill them and take their lives for what they were preaching. And so what did they do? They fled. And did they go and hide? No, they went to another city and immediately began preaching the gospel again. There was no delay. They didn't say, well, let's go and rest a little bit and gather our minds up or maybe have a few good meals and restore our strength. There was really an urgency with the apostles at this time. I mean, they did not know, as we don't know, the time when the Lord will come again. But they had a feeling that they didn't have time to waste. And so when they moved on and went to a city, they started preaching immediately. And I think there's a lesson to be learned from that as well. You know, I know we want to be prepared and do things correctly, but can you prepare too much and delay things unnecessarily? Probably. You have to kind of internally reflect and look at that and say, hey, do I know enough? Can I share what being a Christian is and how to become a Christian with somebody, and pray about it and share that message with others, and be careful that you're not making excuses. Any thoughts on the first passage here?
I like the fact that it says they stayed there no little time. In other words, they spent as much time as they possibly could.
Right.
A long time. So we don't
Yeah, when the people were receiving the message, they stayed and preached it, right? But when they were threatened for preservation of themselves, they moved on and continued preaching somewhere else.
Or if they had to probably went already, because they might have thought they wouldn't have the faith that they had to keep on going, so they could have got weak maybe if they had went read into it, like you said they did.
Mm-hmm.
Might lose their faith
Kind of.
with that.
Right. Kind of like if you fall off the horse, get right back on it and keep going, and don't scare yourself. That's a good point as well. All right, let's read about the lame man here. And starting in verse 8. And in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. So, an amazing miracle that was witnessed by the people here at Lystra. One thing that I couldn't find an answer to is, Paul looked at this person and could tell just by looking at him he had great faith. So, was that a gift, a spiritual gift that he had, maybe, that he could tell these things, or was it just had a look on his face that you could kind of tell that he was receiving the message, receiving the gospel? I don't know, but Paul claimed he could do that. But I think these 3 verses here, it's interesting that the lame man was lame from birth. We know that's kind of important, right? Because him being lame from birth, everyone knew that he was lame. So when he was healed, there was no doubt it was a miracle, right? He wasn't just injured. Everyone knew this about him. But, there's also a parallel here, because when we become Christians, we are born again. And can it be that we are also lame in that we are not walking in Christ's footsteps after our second birth, and doing what we're instructed to do to preach the word and make disciples of all nations, right? So many people become Christians and are like this lame man and never put on their gospel shoes, right? And go forth and make disciples of all nations. So I thought that was an interesting parallel that we could take from this miracle.
like he sprang up and he walked.
He sprang up. He was ready to go.
He jumped a little bit too.
Yeah, trying out those new legs. All right. So the people of Lystra saw this great miracle, saw him get up. And when they saw what Paul had done, starting again in verse 11, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. So were they getting the message? Absolutely not, right? If you imagine you're going to teach somebody something and they're doing the exact opposite of what you're telling them. So in verse 14, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard this, they tore their clothes and ran among the multitude, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men with the same nature as you, and preach to you that you should turn from these useless things to the living God." From these idols, right? Men naturally are idolaters. That's kind of our nature. We have to watch out for that, and we will fall back towards idolatry if we're not vigilant. And that's exactly what was happening here. And the apostles were warning them of this. And so turn away from these useless things and turn to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all things that are in them, who in bygone generations allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness. In that he did good. He gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And that with these sayings, they could scarcely retain the multitudes from sacrificing to them. So if you remember too, and what John just sang about with the children, he sang about exactly this, what Paul and Barnabas were preaching, and saying, hey, there's a living God, and even if we weren't here telling you about it, you should know that there is, because of all the evidence you see in nature. The rain that comes down, the fruits that are there for you, all the blessings that you have, that God has given you through nature and through the world and through your existence. You should at least realize that. Sarah? I think just out of frustration and just showing that, instead of saying, hey, maybe, yeah, in kind of a mourning. So it's a sign of mourning.
Well, they tore
tearing clothes.
their clothes when they were upset.
Yeah.
So we see the chief priest, priest in the case of Jesus and Paul, they tore their coats out of anger.
Right.
It was a symbol of, listen to me, there's something wrong here.
Yeah. Throwing something down on the floor, getting attention too. Right? So we've got this group, and they're not listening. They are praising and worshiping Paul and Barnabas and sacrificing to them, and they're telling them, knock it off. You're not getting the message. And then, so in verse 19, what happens? In 19, the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul, dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. So this is the same group. The same group is just praising these men for the miracle that they just saw and worshiping them. And then they've just been convinced to stone him. And I do believe they thought they killed Paul, drug him out. He doesn't die. I don't mean to spoil the story here, but we'll get to that in a second. But he survives this stoning, but it's the same exact group. And it's a warning for us, because this happens today in the world, and we have to be vigilant that we are not brought into this trap of being worshipped by the world, or we're always instructed to stay humble, right? But when the world lifts you up, it doesn't take very much at all for them to turn against you. We see this in sports all the time, right? You're a winning team. You're the best athlete for the team, and everyone loves you, and then you lose a game, and they'll kick you out on your ear, right? So it happens a lot. And I think this is why the apostles also were instructed, don't take money from anyone. That's just a stepping stone, right? If they start accepting some gifts and a little bit of money to help out, and then pretty soon it becomes a lot more than they bargained for. And then if you know, I believe that it was Satan behind all of this, right? And Satan's behind it. He's behind the praise and the worshiping and the sacrificing, but he couldn't get Paul and Barnabas, right? They didn't fall for it. So if he can't get you through praise, he's going to stone you, right? It's going to be one or the other. He's going to get you there. And if you think there is somebody else that this happened to as well, it took just about 5 or 6 days to go from entering into Jerusalem, riding a donkey. Everyone was cheering, welcoming their new king that they thought that was going to save them. They didn't understand the nature of Jesus' kingship. And that was on Sunday. By Friday, Jesus was on the cross. So, again, another lesson from the world. If you look like you're in good standing, be very careful and look at your situation and those around you. All right, continuing on in verse 20 and 22. However, when the disciples gathered around Paul, he's just been stoned, he rose up and he went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. So here is another example of what we are commanded to do. Jesus says to make disciples of all nations, and that's my question to you. It's not a trick question. It's a pretty simple question. We should know the answer, but how do you make someone a disciple?
Teach and exhort. The two key tools that he used. We can't do the miracle, but we can refer to the miracle.
Right? We can show that, study the Bible, and ultimately, all the things that you're doing them to save that person, to convert them to become a Christian, and then they become a disciple of Christ just by the nature of being saved and being a Christian. So that's really all we mean is make disciples, is make Christians, make believers. And we do that by preaching the gospel and studying the Bible with them. Any other thoughts on making disciples? All right, let's continue on. Verse 23. So when they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord, in whom they had believed. And okay, I think I just had verse 23. So they appointed elders and they fasted about it. So what does the New Testament say about fasting for Christians today? Should we practice fasting?
There's a lot of debate, and we have had periods of fasting here at Hartford, where a certain issue was taking place, or we're commissioning somebody to go into the mission field or something of that nature. We ask people to take the time that they would normally eat a meal and spend that time in prayer and fast.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to admit, I really haven't ever done a spiritual fast myself, but I was looking into things as well for this lesson, and it's, I believe, a biblically sound practice. Of course, it was done a lot in the Old Testament, and the Jews practiced that a lot. And we can even look at, what Jesus thought about fasting, because that was one of the issues that the Jews tried to trip up the apostles about. Say, hey, these guys never fast. They should be fasting. And I think it's Luke 5:35, I believe.
It doesn't seem like you ever find scripture that commands you to fast. So I
Yeah,
think it's optional. It's good that you're sacrificing for inner self and inner reflection on Christ and what He's done. But it's never been commanded because
right. So it's definitely not commanded. You can't find a command where it says you will fast. But this is one of those times that it was, Jesus teaches about some fasting. I guess we can start at verse 33, Luke 5:33. He said to him, "Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink?" And he said to them, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days." So clearly Jesus was not against fasting, and he thought it was an appropriate thing to do, because he said the apostles will fast when he is taken away at that time. So,
He himself did it. We have.
and Jesus fasted,
One
right?
example of that.
Exactly. I don't know if I want to go that long.
Right. Oh, I got you.
But Jesus himself fasted, and we can take Jesus, of course, as a perfect example in all that we do.
Fasting is not how long you go without food. It's what you do in replacement of that meal. And we're reading in chapter 13 earlier, how when the elders had appointed Paul and Barnabas, they did it with fasting and prayer. They probably took the lunch hour and did not eat, but spent that time in prayer. And it gave them a meaningful time together. It's not about just going without food for weight loss. It's for spiritual focus on the topic.
In a tradition of fasting and making sure that everyone knew they were fasting and they had a long faith.
Right. Right. We know that's not appropriate if you're doing it for your own personal benefit or righteousness or feeling to put yourself above others by doing something like that. But exactly, when you give something up, you give up a meal, and then you use that time to read, study the Bible, to pray, to focus on God. And then when you do eat, you're thankful again. You're thankful before the meal, during the meal, after the meal. It gives you an appreciation. You don't you would tend to take things for granted less, right? When you're disciplined to do without something. And again, just kind of it's a good metaphor for giving up things now, the delayed gratification, right? Kind of do without for now, as we will be rewarded again later. You'll have a meal later, and in the same sense where we obey Christ now, we follow the law for a reward later in time when we all get to heaven.
I was going to add one more quick thing here. That is in verse 23. It says, "They appointed elders in every city." We have a tendency, probably rightfully so, to not quickly appoint men to leadership. But these guys have only been Christians a short period of time. And so you have to think, why did
That's a good point.
that are qualified.
And wrapping up this chapter then in verse 24. And after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And now when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Italia. From there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work which they had completed. Now when they had come and gathered the church together, they reported all that God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. So they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So again, and I talked about this a little bit in chapter 12 when we studied that, is the benefits of fellowship and encouraging one another, sharing what they have gone through and the things that they had seen. Of course, this is a time that people are still trying to understand this, right? And understand that this salvation is for everyone, Jews and Gentiles alike. And so they share these stories on how God allowed them to preach to all the people of the world and how it was received, and encourage the other apostles to do the same. And that's really about all I had for chapter 14.
It says they remained there for no little time.
No little time.
After you've been through a trip like that, left for dead, you're tired, no little time was necessary to get their energy level back up.
Yeah, and there's one thing I skipped over I wanted to mention, and it was in verse 22. And can you imagine Paul, who had just survived a stoning, right? His body was bruised and cut, and he's telling people we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. You know, what a powerful message he's giving there as well, right? As you see the results of the stoning on his body, as he's saying that. So it's time to strengthen those that have been converted and give them encouragement, and all the new Christians that were made during that time.
He went back to the city that stoned him.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't afraid to go back and strengthen the Christians there.
Yeah.
I think if
I'd have brought it.
it happened to us, we'd be greatly encouraged and emboldened.
And that's chapter 14. All right. Thank you very much.